Replace the complete strut assembly on this 2007 Elantra HD. It's the same for all Elantra models. Basically, take the wheel off. Obviously, take the wheel off. And the only thing you really have to disconnect here are these hoses. Two 12mm bolts, a short bolt to come right out. No problem. I would spray these bolts first. The major bolts here, these two. This one and this one. Those are going to be 19mm nuts, 17mm bolts. This one here also is going to be a 19mm nut. And if you don't have the 5mm hex in the center of your stabilizer rod end, you're going to need to use a 17mm flat wrench to get in here on this replacement part. This was a replaced part from last year. So basically take off all these bolts. Make sure the entire car is jacked up, because the tension on this stabilizer rod here will be incredible. You'll never get it out of there easily or without screwing it up. Just take the pressure off of both sides. If you have it on one side, that's the torque. So take the pressure off by jacking up both sides first. Remove these two bolts. You can loosen and remove this bolt, these two bolts, and that's pretty much it. Support the bottom of this assembly where the rotor is, just to make sure nothing falls. It really doesn't go too far. But what I did was I put a rod through the middle of one of these bolt holes after I pulled the bolt out, so that I could get back to it later so it wouldn't drop. And there really wasn't any problem. I was able to just swing it under tension out of the way. And then what you need to do is you go to the top up here, and because I'm just replacing the complete setup, I'm not going to be taking the coil apart or anything like that. I bought a loaded, what they call a loaded strut. So all I need to do is take, and I've already loosened these three bolts. So once I've got those lower ones done, then all I need to do is take these three out, and it literally falls into your hand. So I'll come back after I've done some more. These bolts out, these were kind of a bugger. What I had to do was I had to spray some penetrating oil in there and then beat them, loosen the nut. The nuts came off no problem, the bolts were stuck. So I had to use some WD-40 type, penetrating oil and get in there and then try to soak those bolts. And then what I did was I had an impact wrench. I couldn't even turn them with the impact wrench. So I had to use a breaker bar just to get them to budge. Once they budged, then I could hit them from the outside of the nut with a softer hammer. They were able to move. Once they moved, they were fine. So it wasn't that there was any torque or any pressure on this assembly to speak of. It really was just the fact that those bolts were rust. They were rusty and they were stuck. Okay. There's a close-up of that tie rod, or the stabilizer rod end, and maybe you can see the flat on it, but this one does not have the hex because that's a replacement part. Okay, so I got those bolts out, took the two off the side, the two off the bottom, and that stabilizer bar end, and now we're going to take these off the side here. All they have the top, there's three bolts. Notice that it's a triangle pattern, but it's not quite a true triangle. It's kind of like an isosceles triangle where one side is shorter than the other two. And that's important when you go to line it up. Okay, we'll get back after this is out. This will just drop right out. To loosen these bolts up so that they're not completely out, so I've got some play under here so something can drop, and something will drop, trust me on that one. So when I go to get this out, I'm going to pull out my block, and see this piece here, that's loose now. Okay, so I can support this again. I'll do that in a second. And then this piece is literally hanging by those three bolts. So I'm going to go ahead and take those three bolts out. I can actually reach on the top here and pull out the two loose ones easily enough. Okay, so there's one of those, and the second one will come out the same way, and the last one, and this thing will just drop right out. So I'm going to shut this off for a second and get that out, and we'll talk again. That's my old one on the right, new one on the left. And you notice that these triangles are pretty close, and then what you want to do is you want to line these up the same way to make sure that those triangles, okay, see how this has a rounded outside, this has the rounded outside. You want to make sure those things line up, because when you go to put them in there, although this is easily swiveled, it's much easier to have it ready to go in the car when you put it in. So I'm going to slide that in, and we'll go from there. Not have them all the way tight yet. The reason behind that is you want a little bit of wiggle play here so you can get this piece in. See how this will swivel? You can swivel the bracket the same way, but it's kind of a pain if you have to do it from above. So this goes in. I'm going to take this arm, swing this up into place, okay? Something like this. Get this crap out of the way. We're going to get this to line up. Probably going to take two hands to do this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to get the bolts lined up, get one bolt started, and then we'll come back. Was to grab this, push it back and forth while I shove that bolt in there to get it started. Second one went in just as fast as the first one because it wasn't under tension. It was just the rust that kept it in there before. I was able to just tap those in with a hammer once they were almost all the way through. Start my nut here on my stabilizer bar link, and I'm going to tighten up all three of these. Put this bracket back on. Got my brake line brackets, things like that, and this is done. And it will be all set. We'll come back. Good job. I even sprayed my little caliper a little bit with some spray. Yeah, like I said, 3 bolts, major bolts, 19 on the nut, 17 on the bolt, 19 on the nut, 17 open wrench on the flat. It's not that hard. 12 millimeter for these 2 little bolts on the side that hold up these lines, and also I think these are 14 millimeter on the top. And the new bolts were 15 millimeter, but again, not that big of a deal. The main thing was making sure everything was tight and everything was right, but it was no problems as far as things falling and dropping and being too difficult. Just the rusty bolt, like I said before. So this shouldn't be a bad deal. If you bought the whole loaded strut like I did, it saves you a ton of work and a lot of danger. So this is a lot safer to do it this way. And I'll give you some links to where I got the parts in the description.